internet. I must tell you I'm excited today. I have an author here, and I also got a man who wrote a very, very good book. And he's going to speak to us about his time in the army. He's going to tell us why he wrote that book. And this book is really important because it helped a lot of people, especially most of you who suffer from nightmares. A lot of them, after they read this book, realized that they actually need and should and ought to go and get assistance. And I want to say to you, if you're in need for this kind of assistance and you cannot afford it, come to Legacy. We do have psychologists here who will help you for free. And their methods work, we know, because we've been testing it on veterans across the world. Again, free of charge, we don't mind helping you. And no, we don't know what you say to the psychologist at all. Once we refer you to these guys, they take over. And sometimes they say to me, it went well. I've never heard them ever saying to me, it went badly. So Norman McFarlane, welcome to us. Thank you for your time. We struggled a bit to get hold of each other. I must tell you, with the move to Thailand, it was a little bit of a story, but we've got him here now. So welcome, sir. I'm really glad you are here. Can you tell me, where did this start for you?
Thank you very much, Chris, for the lovely introduction. It started for me on the 5th of January 1975, which is the day I reported at Durban Station for my call-up. The book started decades later, and I'll talk about that later on in terms of why I eventually started to write the book. But that was what life was like in the 70s. You got your call-up papers. Yeah, when you turned 16, you were notified that, you know what, you're going to have to go to the army. So you get the paperwork and you're like, okay, yeah, well, that's going to come at a point in the future. I was 19 when I eventually ended up getting called up to go to the army. And like all white South African boys, it was a case of going reluctantly, because I don't know terribly many people who are like, hell yeah, I can't wait for this, because basics is tough. Let's face it. And there's always the risk at that time. You know, you think to yourself, I'm going to go there. I'm going to do my training. I'm probably going to go to the border and I might end up getting killed. So, yeah, I was a bankgat when I was a kid. It wasn't, you know, it was like, wow, this is terrible. I'm going to go. I don't have a choice, because, you know, it was a case of, in those days, certainly, I mean, there was no such thing as an end conscription campaign in those days. There was nothing like that. You either went or you ended up in jail. And then, of course, there's the societal pressure. You know, my mom and dad, my late mom and dad, you know, it was kind of, it's your duty. You've got to go and fight for your country. You moet maar niet gaan. You know, there's no choice. And our society at the time, if you said, look, I'm not going to go, the opprobrium that was heaped on you and the criticism that was heaped on you because you're not doing your duty was enormous. So there's a lot of pressure in circumstances like that. And when I went in to the military, I was very conflicted from a political perspective, deeply conflicted, because of my background and my history, which I can't talk about in the sense that I was the nephew of Donald Woods, the late Donald Woods, who was the editor of the Daily Dispatch, and he built an uneasy relationship with the apartheid government of the time. In fact, he caused an enormous amount of mayhem because he had the temerity to employ black and colored reporters and seat them in the same newsroom as the white reporters. And then, of course, he had many interactions with Jimmy Kruger, who was Minister of Police at the time, because his home was attacked. His housekeeper, who lived on the premises and was pretty much a member of the family, was frequently harassed by the security police and by the local police, suggesting that there was something wrong and that she was a prostitute or something of that order. So bricks thrown through the window, all sorts of issues like that. So I grew up at Donald's feet in the Transkei, listening, because I was young. I was 14, 15 years old, listening to Donald talk about the politics of the day in a family which didn't necessarily hold his views. And I just sat and listened. And Donald spoke eloquently. He never lost his temper. He was never rude to anybody, but he was forthright in his views about what was happening in our country and the direction in which things ought to be heading. So that was my political awakening at Donald's feet. So when I went into the military, I was conflicted. the zwart gevaar and the rooi gevaar, particularly the rooi gevaar, I was like, there is no way that we want a communist government in this country. So, you know what? Despite the fact that I know that what's happening in this country is wrong, at the end of the day, we don't want a communist government. That's unacceptable. So that was my conflict when I went. Do I go? Don't I go? I was a bangbroek. There was no ways I would have said, no, I'm not going on political grounds, because I would have ended up in Turkey for 8 years, and I wasn't prepared to have that happen. So off I went. And it was tough. It was rough. Basics is hard by any person's standards, but we got through basics successfully. And then, of course, you build relationships with people. You end up making mates with people you didn't know before you got there. And those bonds become very firm and tight bonds, Chris, tight bonds. And those are bonds that will last a lifetime. I mean, we're heading for nearly 5 decades. And to this day, I still am in touch with so many of my friends, albeit via WhatsApp and the odd telephone call. I'm still in touch with those people. We still talk regularly. We confer with each other. My biggest regret is that I don't live in Durban, because I could go to the Gunners' Lunch every month, and it would be wonderful to see all my friends again. So those bonds played a very important role in my sanity in later stages when I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, because maintaining that contact and having them in my corner and them knowing, and their constant affirmation and support, it was always a case of, how are you doing, Norm? Are you okay? Anything we can do to help you? So that played quite a significant role in my desire to seek recovery and to seek treatment so that I could get better. But when I started writing the book, I started writing the book because, I went into therapy in June 2010. I realized that I was in serious trouble and that I needed to find help. So I went and sought help. I got a local psychologist in Somerset West, and I was in her care for 3 years. It took that long to get to a point where I was able to cope. I wasn't healed. You don't ever get healed from post-traumatic stress disorder, any mental health disorder. You can't be healed. It's just a reality. It's part of your life, and you need to manage it as best as you can. So I got to a point where I was functioning largely okay. Not perfectly, but I was largely okay. I could cope with most of what life threw at me. And at the time, I had tried to bury everything about my military service. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to remember. I discarded everything. I discarded things I shouldn't have discarded, because later on, when I started to write the book, I realized that I'd made a mistake by doing that, because when I went into therapy, I then wanted to start remembering. And I started to make phone calls. I got hold of my mates that I hadn't spoken to for a very long time. And slowly but surely, the group coalesced, and we came together in this group that's called Army Vets, which is a WhatsApp group in which we keep in touch with each other. And more people join as we find people that we've lost touch with, and they become part of the group. And it's literally, because every time you can communicate with somebody for the first time in decades, it's as if you saw each other yesterday. That's how close the bonds are. And that's one of the things I value so much about being a veteran and having people who served with you and who are that close to you. And that bond is one that most people who've never been in combat can't understand, and it's a bond that will never be broken. Even if there are political differences, if we have different political and societal views, we are still tight, and we will remain tight. So I said to my psychologist at the time, I want to write a book about it. She said, this is not the right time to do it. She said, you need to get yourself to a point where you can cope better, and then you can write the book. And it took 3 years. And that's when I started to write the book in 2014. And then the reason I wrote the book, started writing the book, was because at that time there was more and more being written academically about the border war, about the Angolan conflict. And I read voraciously everything I could find. I wanted to know more. I wanted to understand better what had happened up there outside of the combat theater that we were in. And I was appalled to see that Battle Group Boxer and Battle Group X-Ray, which are the two battle groups I fought in 75, 76 in Angola, literally earned a one-line mention in an academic treatise that appeared in one of the publications from the University of Stellenbosch Military History Department. And I thought, but this is wrong. This is wrong. We fought. We were up there. There was a large group of us that went up, armor, artillery, and I'm an artilleryman, infantry. It was just, I was horrified that we didn't exist. So I thought to myself, I'm going to set the record straight. I'm going to write the story about our experiences up there as I recall them, because we deserve to be known for what happened to us. It's people need to understand what happened up there. People need to understand what we were involved in, what we did, what we saw, and what we experienced. But then as time unfolded, as I was writing the book, and it took a long time, because I started writing in 2014 and I actually only finished the book in 2020, which is a hell of a stretch to get a book written at 6 years. Because I would start writing furiously and I'd write 2,000-3,000 words, and then I'd say I'd write 1,000 words a day, and then I'd stop. And then I wouldn't touch the book manuscript for 3 or 4 months or 5 months or whatever the case may be. So very much a start-stop affair. But anyway, as the book wore on and I started getting through the narrative thread of the book, getting out of the military after our time up there, going back and doing camps back up on the border for camps, and then eventually being demobilized, I realized that the book was a little more than just telling our story. The book was about post-traumatic stress disorder, how it affected me, how it affected my family, how it affected my business and social life. And that's when I began to realize that there was more to this book than just being a war story. Because even the narrative about our time in conflict is not, definitely not, because that's not what I wanted to write, is that we won the war single-handedly. In fact, the contrary. It's the reality of combat. It's the reality of the horror of what you confront and what you see and what you do, and the impact that that has on you as a human being, which is irrevocable. You can't scrub your eyeballs. You can't scrub your brain. You can't forget what happened. And as much as I did try to forget before I started writing the book, you can't, Chris. It comes back. It comes back in dreams. It comes back in nightmares. It troubles you. And it still troubles me to this day, and it will trouble me for the rest of my life. Having said that, I've gotten to a point where I'm largely at peace with the contradiction of my political and social background and the desire to fight a war. And I've come to terms with it, and I write about the book in the conclusion, my thoughts about this and how this conflict has troubled me for such an immensely long time. But I finally come to terms with it. But the key thing here is that the whole business of post-traumatic stress disorder, I thought I was okay after spending time initially with a psychologist, and who eventually retired, and then along came COVID. Things went south for me again. I started to struggle more, and then along came my new job, as I'm now a ward councillor in the city of Cape Town, and it was a hell of a thing to tackle, because you don't really know what you're getting yourself into until the rubber hits the road, so to speak, and you begin to understand this job that you've tackled, which is going to be with you for the next 5 years. And I was having struggles elsewhere. I've been a member of Volunteer Wildfire Service for 5 years, and I've served as a volunteer firefighter, as a crew leader. I've served in management capacities for the unit for 5 years. And in that environment, I was running into difficulties as well. So I just eventually literally started to fall to pieces. And in February, I actually had to take a month's sick leave, because I had to go back into therapy, which I did. And so it comes back to haunt you, Chris. It doesn't go away. And I was off for a whole month. I went into therapy. I came back out of that month and I was much better. But eventually in June, I actually ended up in psych ward. I was in psych ward for 2 weeks, and I was in the care of a psychologist and a psychiatrist to get my head right, and also to get my meds right, because I'm on medication for the rest of my days. And I've gotten to a point where I used to be very embarrassed about this, but I've gotten to a point where I realize being embarrassed about your condition is pointless. That's like being embarrassed about having diabetes, sugar diabetes. And you know, when you tell people you've got sugar diabetes, what do? They say, "Yeah, I'm so terribly sorry to hear that. My thoughts are with you. I hope everything's going to be okay." You tell people that you've got a mental health problem, and they're like, maybe we better, oh, you know, this guy's unstable. Oh, what's going to happen next? Is he going to want to hit me or shout or whatever the case? People just don't see mental health issues in an appropriate context. Anybody who's got any other kind of medical challenge, everybody's sympathetic. But when you tell people that you're mentally ill, and it's a brutal statement, I am mentally ill. I suffer from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and I will suffer with it for the rest of my life. But I need to manage it and handle it. And the struggle is real. And it's a constant attention, mindfulness every single day of my life that I have to manage the way I interact with the world. Because if I don't, I could end up back in psych ward. So I'm fine. I'm okay now. I'm coping. Life is working. Life is going well. But I'll have it for the rest of my life. And the joy of the book so far, Chris, has been, it was launched on the 21st of April, and I then had a couple of launch events, which took place 3rd of May, 5th of May, and 6th of May. I actually flew up to Durban to go and do a book talk at the Gunners Association monthly lunch in Durban. And all my mates that were in the military with me then, most of them that are still alive, live in and around Durban. And they've coalesced and come together as a group. I'm part of the group on WhatsApp, and we talk regularly and we support each other. But I thought I owed it to them to fly to Durban at my own expense and go and talk to them about the book and do a launch event and so on and so forth, which I did. And Exclusive Books came out with books as a book with a bookseller, and she brought 20 books, and the 20 books vanished in about 4 minutes. And where the rest of the books we want to buy, because people, after I'd spoken, wanted to buy the book because I told the story I'm telling to you now. And so many people came up to me and sat with me and said, "I bought a book, would you sign it, please?" And I did, and I gave a personal note to everybody. And pretty much all of them said, "Thank you very much. I'm so pleased that I came today. I'm so pleased that I've listened to you speak, and I'm so pleased I bought your book." Because it sounds like from what you've said that I will be able to find help. I've struggled. In the one instance, a colleague of mine, a comrade of mine, sat down and he said, "I've lost my wife, I've lost my family. I'm struggling business-wise. I have night sweats, I have nightmares. I'm struggling, I can't cope." And he said, "I'm going to seek help because of what you said today, and I'm going to get myself right." And that's happened time and time and time again, Chris. People find me on Facebook and they send me a private WhatsApp, Facebook message, and they thank me for writing the book. They thank me for what I've said, and they're thanking me for helping them decide to go and seek the help that they need so that they can get their lives back on an even keel. And if that's what the book's achieved, I'm happy, because that ultimately was the goal of the book, was to share my story so that people would take hope. And because when you're mired in a mental illness like this, it's hopeless. You just feel powerless. You feel that there's no way out. And so many people who've been in this circumstance have committed suicide and died in the most awful circumstances. Friends of mine and comrades of mine have died in the most dreadful circumstances. They've lost everything. They've gone down there. They've succumbed to substance abuse, to alcoholism. Some of them have committed suicide. Others have just died in the most shocking conditions. And my heart breaks every time I hear a story like that. So for me, that's the significance of the book. If that's what the book has achieved, I feel it's been worthwhile writing the book, which wasn't easy. It was not easy to write the book, because obviously it's a narrative that started when I went into the military, with backstory about my life, obviously, because the first portion of the book talks about my young life and my upbringing. But then it's the narrative of combat and what happened subsequently. Because you're writing about stuff that you did and saw, when you get to write about it, it's not easy. It's difficult. I remember when I was reading the proofs, the page proofs of the book, I was sitting in our living room. My wife was sitting at the dining room table as well, and we were working away. And I got up and I was walking around, and I was all on edge. And she said, "What's wrong?" I said, skin is crawling as I'm reading what I'm reading, proofreading this manuscript. And it was over and over and over and over again that I had to reread. I'm better now, but it was not easy. It was not easy. But yeah, it's been a journey. It's been an amazing journey. It's been an uplifting journey, and for that, I'm deeply grateful, and I'm deeply humbled by the response to the book. I'm deeply humbled by the response to the book, because it tells me that it was a worthwhile journey to pursue. So yeah, that's my story.
You know, Norman, we were talking so away and I was listening. We forgot to say the name of the book.
The book is titled Across the Border, Surviving the Secret War in Angola.
That's right.
That's
what the book is called. How did you get to that name?
Well, that's an interesting one, because when you write a book like this and you get a major publisher to agree to publish the book for you, and I was very fortunate to get NB publishers, Nationale Book, to publish the book. That you don't get to make all the decisions about what goes on the cover or the back. You don't get to make the decisions about the title. That's up to the marketing team, and they make those decisions on your behalf. So they came at me with 3 titles. I had a title for the book, and the title of the book, when eventually I got to the commissioning editor that I started working with, Jill Moody, and she read my manuscript, she said, the book title is going to have to change. I said, what? It's a perfectly good title as far as I'm concerned. She says, yes, but it won't make people pick the book up off the shelf and want to read it. Because the title I had was A War Remembered. She said, that is so boring. So I said, okay, fine, you guys come up with a title. And eventually they did come at me with 3 titles, and I arranged them in order that I disliked them least, because I disliked all 3 titles. And eventually, after much toing and froing with my commissioning editor, she said, look, why don't you just come up with some titles and give them to us, and we'll take a look at them. And as it happened, one of the titles, and I actually sat down with my wife and we brainstormed what titles could be. And initially it was they wanted Boy on the Border. And I said, it wasn't about being on the border. It was about being across the border. It was our time in Angola. That's largely what I wanted to write about, because that's where all of this went down and happened. So that's where across the border comes from, as opposed to on the border or Boy on the Border, whatever the case may be. And surviving the secret war in Angola. So I actually came up with that whole title myself. And they came back to me, and I sent them like 14 options. And they came back and said, this is perfect. This is perfect. And the picture on the front cover is not the picture I would have wanted, because it actually shows 90 mil Eland in the background. And the gun barrel sticking out is actually an Eland gun barrel, not a 25-pounder. But we couldn't find any photographs that were good quality enough, showing artillery pieces that could go on the front cover of the book. So yeah, those decisions all get taken by such people. And I was just very grateful that a major publisher was prepared to pick up the book. So it's not self-published. I think I mentioned to you earlier, I've just received my first large royalty check, and it's like way more than I expected. I'm like, where did all that money come from? And then I looked at the bank statement. Okay, fine, I understand where this money comes from. So, and the book has been selling well, because it's been selling extremely well. They printed 3,000 as a first run, and we're well over 2,000 sales of the 3,000. So the chances are they'll probably do a reprint of the book. I'm hoping there'll be a spike in sales over Christmas, when people are looking for stuff for partners and fathers and grandfathers and stuff like that. And not because of the royalties, but because I want people to read the book. I mean, I've had multiple interviews. I've had television interviews. I've had multiple radio interviews. I've had a number of podcasts. I've had, I don't know how many newspaper interviews about the book, and discussions and articles published. So, I mean, I was blessed with an enormous amount of publicity for the book. And I know that must have had an influence on book sales. And for that, I'm deeply grateful as well. Again, not because of the royalties, but because more people get to read the book. More people get to understand what happened to us, the war we fought, why we were there, the conflicts that we had to struggle with mentally, emotionally, and psychologically. And the fact that for those of us who were combatants at the time, or people whose members of their family were combatants at the time, see that there's hope. You can get to a point where you're okay. You can get to a point where you're okay. And when you're okay, you can live your life, because life goes on. And all of a sudden, you're not walking in this gray cloud, because for 45 years, I suffered with chronic depression and life was gray. There was no sunshine in my life. But this most recent experience where I went through going into psych ward and going back into counseling, I remember going to my psychologist the one day, and I walked in the door and she looked at me and she said, "Where's this Norman from?" So I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "This is not a Norman I've ever seen before." So I said to her, "This is the old Norman. This is the Norman that existed before the 5th of January, 1975. He's back and he's walking on sunshine." And I actually said that. I had a grin on my face that, and she said, "Well, Norman, this is fabulous to see," because that was the first indication I had with that round of going back into therapy, that things were getting better. I was learning to cope better, because it's about learning to cope. It's about learning to be mindful. It's about discipline and doing what you have to do to stay on track, how you deal with people. Fight, flight is a very common condition that you end up with when you struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder. You either want to lick some people or you want to run and hide. And you spend a lot of your time between those two extremes. And the idea is to be in the middle, where everything is largely okay and that you're functioning normally as a human being, which pretty much all the time I am these days.
I will put all the links in the back for people to look at to get hold of a book. But I'm wondering, as you were speaking, were people aware of your connection to Donald Woods? Because for those of you who forgot, Donald Woods was famous, infamous, I suppose. The security police were definitely after him. I'm surprised they didn't kill him, frankly. It could have gone that way. If I might be very rude, I might say what saved him is his white skin. Now, I know there's a lot of people who's going to look at me with square eyes, but there was a possibility. So, were you keeping it like a secret, or did the military intelligence people knew about it?
Oh, they knew about it. They knew about it. And the reason I know they knew about it is, I mean, just briefly to talk about Donald, I was his nephew by marriage. And when I was a youngster in my early mid-teens, in fact, in my early life, I spent a lot of time in Hobeni, at Hobeni, which is the ancestral home of the Woods family in the Transkei. And we were literally there every single year for a holiday. They kept Donald and Wendy and the kids lived in East London, where he was editor of the Daily Dispatch, as you know. And his brother Harland and Harland's wife Dawn, my aunt, they lived down at Hobeni, and Harland ran a big trading business at Hobeni. So we were down there regularly for holidays. They had a camp down at the sea, and we used to go down to the sea, spend time there doing what teenagers do, fishing, having fun, etc., etc. So in the evening, there would be discussion. There would always be discussion. And inevitably it turned to politics because of Donald's views about how our society worked at the time and how it ought to work. And the uneasy relationship we had with the Bureau of State Security and the secret police, the uneasy relationship we had with then Minister of Police Jimmy Kruger, and the way in which he and his family were handled. And it was disgraceful. But I used to sit at Donald's feet and listen to him talk to the rest of the assembled company, pretty much all family. And not everybody agreed on the way things ought to be. So there was often quite robust discussion. But Donald never lost his temper. He was never rude. And generally it was him against the rest. But, that's not a criticism. It's just the reality of what our society was like at the time. And I sat and listened to what Donald was talking about. And that's where my political awakening happened. That's where I began to understand more about how our society functioned or didn't function. So when I went into the military, I was conflicted because I knew that what was happening in our country was wrong. I knew that things had to change. But at the time, the prevailing narrative was die swart gevaar, die rooi gevaar, and particularly die rooi gevaar. I mean, I was like, I know things have to change in this country, but what we definitely don't want is a communist government. Not interested. And that was one of the factors that drove me to go. But I was also a bunbrook. There's no way I was prepared to not go. My parents would have been very upset if I'd have said I'm not going. I would have ended up in Chuki for 8 years, and I was a bunbrook. I didn't want to spend 8 years in jail. Not interested. So I went unwillingly, but I went. And once I was there, I went through my military service. But it was Donald's discussion, it was Donald's viewpoints that so heavily influenced me, and that caused such tremendous conflict for me during the time that I was up there and subsequently. And I don't think I'll ever reconcile the fact that, despite the fact that I know that war is an absolute abomination and it is completely wrong, and I know for a fact that if opportunity arose where I had to go back, and not to fight apartheid's war, don't get me wrong, not to fight apartheid's war, but just to be back in that same space with your friends, with your comrades. It's just this peculiar realization that we would go in a heartbeat, and pretty much all of my comrades feel exactly the same way. So it's a contradiction. And I actually do quote a poem from Chas Lotter in the book, which talks about this. Now that the war is over, are we going to be, sort of paraphrasing from his poem, Legacy of War? Largely, it's a case of, now that the war is over, are we going to be okay mowing the lawn on Sundays and going to visit Auntie? And the reality, of course, is, as an ex-combatant, that's not the case, because of the way our heads work as a result of time we spent in combat. So, yeah, Donald influenced me enormously. And I'm okay with the contradictions with which I still live. And I will always, I have to be okay with them, because I can't continue to struggle with the contradictions. I just can't do that. So I'm okay at the moment.
Well, Chas Lotter, if I'm not mistaken, was a medic in the Rhodesian army.
Mm.
And he wrote many books. And I think one of them, my favorite, would be called Padre, or Padre. And it is also something like one of the greatest poems I think was ever written.
Mm.
And then you realize the price you pay for the war. And that's perhaps what people don't realize. It gets you from behind. It's not a physical wound, that people can, but there's something happening in your head, and you can't. When did you first realize, Norm, that there's something wrong with you? And I don't mean it negatively, just that, man,
I'll tell you when it all started to unwind. June 2010. So I was a journalist before I became a city councillor. I was a journalist for 14 years, and I wrote a current affairs column in the paper that I was writing for at the time. And I went to watch a movie with a friend. And the movie was a very well-known Afrikaans soapie that was on in South Africa for a considerable period of time. And I don't recall the exact name of the soapie, but they came out of the movie which used the same name, but it was a movie about two guys that had fought in the Bush War, had demobilized, and Darren Kalfkens played the leading role. And he went over the edge, and he ended up in serious trouble. And it was post-traumatic stress disorder. And I looked at that and I thought to myself, this feels and sounds so familiar. It feels and sounds so familiar. And I'd been reading at that stage of the game as well, quite a lot. And I'd made contact with my friends. And I began to realize that I had a problem. I'd known for a long time. I actually knew I had a problem. And my wife would say to me, Norman, you've got to, there were episodes. I had episodes. But it was this just confluence of this movie that just brought the whole thing home to me rather suddenly. And a music video that was recorded by Boek van Blerk called McFarlane. And I remember I was sitting upstairs in my office the one day, and I was watching this video play over and over again, and I was crying. The tears were streaming down my face. My wife arrived home, and she walked in. She said, "What's wrong?" And I just pointed at the screen. She came and looked, and she said, "Norman, this has got to come to an end. Now you've got to actually go and find help. You can't go on like this." So all of that happened at the same time. And I then put pen to paper for the very first time and wrote about my experiences. I'd never written a single word about my time up there. Not a word. And I'm a prolific writer, but I just couldn't, of course, I couldn't up until then. And I wrote a piece which appeared in my column. And the title of the piece was, oh, I can't even remember the title of the piece. But basically it was the first casualty of war. The first casualty of war is innocence. That was the title of the piece. And I actually borrowed that from Oliver Stone's movie Platoon, because that was the tagline for that movie. But it resonated with me. And I wrote the piece, and that started that process. And that's when I decided I actually had to go and seek help. And I then went and saw a psychologist. And because way back in the 90s, I already knew that I was not right, but South African man. What are you talking about? I'm not going to see a shrink. I can deal with this myself. There's nothing wrong. I can cope with it. It's fine. Everything's okay. You know the deal. And my poor wife, and bless her, because she supported me solidly through this terribly difficult time. My family supported me through this really difficult time. And it just had to come to an end. And she said to me, "You've got to go and get this sorted. You've got to go and get this sorted." So I did. And that's how I eventually ended up going into therapy. But like I said, there was no magic wand. It wasn't a case of I went into therapy and all of a sudden I was okay. I was in and out for 3 years, because I would go into counseling and I would start to make progress. And then I'd say, "You know what? I've got this. I'm done." And I wouldn't go back. 6 months later, I'm knocking on my psychologist's door and saying, "I'm in trouble. Come back." Third time, she said to me, "I'll take you back and I'll treat you. But if you decide to stop treatment before you are ready," she said, "and you come back to me a fourth time, I will not treat you. I will refer you to somebody else." And that scared me. So I thought, you know what? I'm actually going to stick it out this time. And I did. And that's when I got to a point where I was okay enough to continue with my life.
But did the army or state give you any assistance whatsoever?
I've got a hearing problem as a result of being an artilleryman and firing hundreds of rounds, fire for effect. I was a number 3, so I was sitting on the gun. I couldn't put my fingers in my ears because I was the guy who pulled the trigger. And I have a hearing problem to this day, which I know is as a result of my time up there. I mean, there were times when I was stone deaf after a big engagement for anything up to a day. I could barely hear a thing. And I went, and eventually in 2018, my younger daughter said to me, "Dad, you've got to go and have your hearing checked, because the part that is designed to handle hearing atrophies if it's not stimulated. So if you can't hear stuff, your brain is actually going to atrophy, and that can lead to all sorts of complications like Alzheimer's, etc. That scared the hell out of me. So I engaged with an audiologist. I went and had my hearing checked, and sure enough, the frequency range with which I struggle most is the one that would be in the vicinity of where an artillery shell cartridge detonating and spitting out a projectile would have been. So I've got hearing aids. I'm glad I've got them, because when I got them for the first time, I heard stuff I hadn't heard for 35 years. All of a sudden, it was like, you know. So yeah, there was that, and I've had no support. I mean, I've sought help myself. I've funded it through my medical aid and out of my pocket to get myself to the point where I'm okay. And I mean, I still see my psychologist once every 2 weeks, and I see my psychiatrist quarterly. And I say that without embarrassment, because there's no, you can't afford to be embarrassed about it in affliction like this, particularly if you want to get the message out there that it's actually really okay. I'm not crazy. I just have a mental health condition that I have to deal with, and I need the tools and the capabilities to deal with it, the skills, and those skills and competencies you learn when you go into psych ward, because that's what they do. You spend time with occupational therapists and so on and so forth, and you learn how to cope better with life and what's coming your way.
You talked about the WhatsApp group. I think you
Mm.
call it Army Vets.
Yeah, it's called Army Vets, which is, there's another one called Gunners Junction, which is a much bigger group, and there are a lot more people on it that I don't know. But Army Vets is just the group, literally the guys that were in Fort Field Battery, which is part of 4th Regiment during our time in the Army 75, 76, and then camps later on.
Yeah, that was part of Savannah.
Yeah. Yeah, Op Savannah started around about July. There were the first rumblings and the first cross-border incursions went into Angola, initially to Rokana, to the waterworks, and then further in. We went up in, we moved from to Siberia, Katima, Malilu, Mapacha, etc., to Grootfontein in November 1975. And we eventually got back to Potch on the 6th of February 1976. And we were demobilized and sent home. And again, it was, we arrived back at the unit, and we were kept apart completely from the new recruits that had started at the beginning of January. We had a separate parade. Our OC came and thanked us for our service. We had to hand our kit back, and we were just told, right, you're not allowed to communicate with anybody. You're not allowed to talk to anybody here. You must just now go home. And we arrived at 6 in the morning, Chris, and by 4:30 that afternoon, we were gone. They just wanted to get rid of us as quickly as they can. And they said, don't remember, you signed the Official Secrets Act document. If you breathe a word about where you've been and what you've done, you're going to end up in jail. But I knew they were watching, and I know they were watching me as a result of my connection with Donald Woods, because in 1978, I was down in Port Elizabeth on business. I was working for a company that was doing a lot of television work, and I needed shots of a military base and soldiers drilling and so on and so forth. So Gailey wandered down to a military base in Port Elizabeth at Drift Sands, and drove up to the gate with our mobile television unit and said to the gate guard, do you mind if we come in and take some movies and so on? I mean, you know what was happening in 1978, what life was like. It was interesting. And so off we went, and we did this whole bunch of shooting and taking pictures and all the bits and pieces, and drove out again, and we're heading back up towards Utenhage, got up onto the top of the bluff and looked back down. I said, stop, let's just take a couple of general shots from here of the whole military base. And while we're busy out there with the cameras and we're shooting and whatever the case may be, we hear sirens. And the next thing is 2 military vehicles pull up with 4 people in each, MPs, guns bristling, and they promptly arrest us and cart us back down to the base. And we get locked in we get ushered into a building, all of which windows are barred, and we get put in a room, and the door gets locked and we get left. And eventually they come and grab me, and they drag me in. They ask for our ID numbers and our IDs and whatnot, which we gave them. And the next thing, I get dragged in to speak to this Aoki, a major, an intelligence major. And he's got a faxed file of my military record on the desk in front of him. And he took me on. He said, klink vir my jy's 'n communist, want jy's verwant aan Donald Woods. So they knew all about it. And it was a hell of a thing. It really was. I mean, yeah, I realized we were actually in deep you-know-what. But thankfully, I was doing work for a major motor company in Utenhage at the time. So I managed to persuade the guy to phone my client and just verify who we were and what we were doing. And they demanded the videotapes. So we had to give them the videotapes that we'd been using to shoot all this the stuff that we were shooting there. And I was really, really, really angry. I mean, I took part in a march when I was in high school in Johannesburg because of the hostile situation in Alexandra Township. They knew about that. It was in my record. They knew about the fact that I participated in that illegal march. So yeah, and they were watching. And much later, some years later, when we were living in Johannesburg, I eventually put my hand up to stand for Parliament with the Democratic Party shortly after it was formed. And they were watching me. There was a car parked outside my house most of the time through the election campaign with two gentlemen with ill-fitting suits and wraparound dark sunglasses who were just there. And my wife eventually said, "What's going on?" So I said, "It's security police. They're watching me." Because they knew about my relationship with Donald Woods, etc., etc. So yeah, they knew everything. And then much later, when we moved down to Somerset West and I was a journalist, I met up with somebody who's become a dear friend who now lives on the West Coast. And he was up there at the same time as me, but not with the same battle group. He was with Battle Group Orange, and he was in the ACAC, anti-aircraft. And he then moved into the intelligence service when he demobilized. And he eventually left the intelligence service, but he'd retained, spooks always retain contacts. It's a lifelong thing. And we got talking on an occasion, and I spoke about my military service. He spoke about his military service. And he then disclosed to me a couple of months later that he'd had me checked out. And it came as a bit of a shock because we were all told that our security police files would be destroyed after 1994. And it came as a bit of a shock to me to discover that my security police record is still fully intact, because he was able to get insight into what was going on in my security police record. And he recounted to me all of the stuff, that the issue with the military base in Port Elizabeth, being watched during the campaign in Johannesburg, the whole works. So all that stuff still sits somewhere in a brown file somewhere in Pretoria, I would imagine, or something of that order. Came as a bit of a shock.
Have you ever felt threatened?
No, I can't say I have. People have said to me, "Aren't you going to get into trouble for writing about this?" So I said, "I don't know, but I don't care. I'm going to write it anyway." And I'm not the first person to write a book about time up there. There have been many books prior to mine that have been written about military service and combat service as well. So, at the time it was forbidden, but things have changed since 1994. And so the book's out there. Nobody's come and knocked on my door and said, "You've broken the law. We're going to have you in jail for the Official Secrets Act because you've said what you shouldn't say." It's just not going to happen. Yeah. So the other thing is that, which I'm quite pleased about, is that the Southern Historical Review is doing a review of the book. They've asked for a copy of the book, and they're doing a review. And an academic at University of Witwatersrand, Christo Doherty, in the history department, he's doing that review. And the Saldanha Military Academy have requested a copy of the book because they'd like to read it and do a review of it as well. So I'm waiting for those two reviews to appear as well. And that is quite affirming for two institutions like that to ask, because I would imagine it's because they see that there's some merit in the text and that maybe it is of value in the context of what happened back then and in those times. And again, deeply humbling, of course, when institutions like that choose to acquire a copy of your book because they want to review it. The message I'd like to send to everybody who's watching this, who has struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder. And post-traumatic stress disorder is just not something that is the exclusive preserve of military veterans. I have a personal assistant who works for me as ward councillor, and she was involved in a terrible motor accident where she was driving. Fortunately, nobody was killed, but she struggles to this day with post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is not something that is limited to military service. There are millions of people in this world who are struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. Most of them aren't aware of the fact that they have the condition, but they actually need to find help, because life is hell. Life is hell if you struggle with PTSD and you don't seek help. Life is hell. It's just hell. So my urgent and ardent message to everybody out there who is struggling with this condition is to go and seek help and get yourself better, because you can. You won't be cured, but you will learn to cope, and life will suddenly become brighter and sunnier, and it'll be like it was in the old days. And that's the message that I want to communicate to everybody who's watching. If you're a combat vet, please, and you are struggling, believe me, you need to seek help. Because as another combat vet said to me a little while ago when we were having a chat over Zoom as well, he said, I think I've got a little bit. There's no such thing as a little bit. You either have post-traumatic stress disorder or you don't. The notion that I've got a little bit and I can cope is flawed, because you then I then spoke to this particular person's wife, and her response was, he's got it big time and he needs to do something about it. But we're men, we're tough, nothing can stop us, we're okay, we can deal with this stuff ourselves. And I've discovered the hard way that that's not true.
So if you do know that you need help, what do?
You reach out to a psychologist. That's your first port of call. And the best way to do that is to go and talk to your GP. Have a conversation with your GP about this and say, this is what you're struggling with. Can your GP refer you to a psychologist, which your GP will happily do. And then you take it from there. And the psychologist will then put you on the road to recovery and coping and determine whether you need to see a psychiatrist or not, and will help shepherd you through that process. And those are the steps that one needs to take in order to deal with this condition. And the longer you delay it, the more you're going to suffer and struggle, and the more those around you are going to struggle. Because post-traumatic stress disorder is not something that you endure on your own. It's something that affects your loved ones. It's something that affects the people with whom you work. It affects your friends. It affects all of your relationships. And the best thing you can do is seek help. It's actually the brave thing to do. People think, I'm not a coward. I'm not going to go and get this sorted out. I can deal with it. The brave thing to do is to seek help. That's what one ought to do, is to seek help.